Did a hashtag save lives? Iran sentenced these 3 men to death, but a storm on social media may have halted their hanging. I'm Ali Aslan, and today's newsmaker is Iran's suspended executions. Three men were among thousands protesting against a hike in fuel prices. A few months later, they were given the death penalty. But a campaign to save them exploded on social media. Millions tweeted using the hashtag #DoNotExecute, and it seems the authorities took notice. The young protesters were given a reprieve after the Supreme Court accepted their request for a retrial. Some hope it's a turning point for the country, but as Adam Platz reports, Iran is still the second biggest executor in the world.
Iran has halted the execution of 3 men arrested during anti-government protests in November 2019. Human rights groups say thousands of people were detained and more than 300 killed during the unrest, which was sparked by a rise in oil prices. The decision to allow a retrial came after a social media campaign under the Farsi hashtag #DoNotExecute. It was shared millions of times, including by President Trump, and was briefly the world's most popular tweet, resonating with recent protests in the US.
3 young men who are being sentenced to death, they have names as well. Say their names. Saeed, Amir Hossein, Mohammed. You know, when George Floyd was killed, all the world rightfully got united and shouted his name. But right now, 3 innocent people are being sentenced to execution, and we don't see their names in any media.
Amnesty International says the men's trial was grossly unfair, that they were denied access to lawyers and tortured to extract confessions. The UN also condemned the sentencing.
The imposition of the death penalty on the basis of overbroad national security charges would amount to an egregious violation of Iran's human rights obligations, including the prohibition of torture, as well as the rights to life, liberty and security, and to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly.
The High Court's original decision to uphold the sentences also led to street demonstrations, such as in the town of Behbahan, with protesters chanting against the poor economy and the death sentences. Analysts close to the story say Tehran does not normally apply the death penalty to people arrested during protests, but it had executed men under espionage and terrorism charges in the days before. Other than China, Iran carries out more executions than any other country, with a total of 251 in 2019. With US sanctions crippling the Iranian economy, has Tehran buckled under pressure, or has it genuinely heard the people's outcry? Adam Platz, the Newsmakers.
So, why were these executions suspended? To discuss that, I am now joined from the Iranian city of Isfahan by Setara Sadeki. She's a PhD student at Tehran University. Cameron Khansarinia is in Washington, D.C. He's the policy director for the National Union for Democracy in Iran. And in Istanbul is Borzu Daragahi. He's an international correspondent for The Independent. Glad to have you all on the program. Cameron, Iran has halted the execution of 3 men after the hashtag #DoNotExecute went viral globally. Now, Tehran is not exactly known to bow down to international pressure. Why were these executions halted and suspended?
Well, Ali, thank you for having me today, and it's a pleasure to be with you. It's a good question. This shows that the Islamic Republic in Iran does bend to international pressure and to domestic pressure. It's important to clarify a few things from the introduction of this show. First of all, the protests that these 3 men, Amir Hossein, Mohammed, and Saeed, took part in November were not merely against the increase in fuel costs. They perhaps started that way, but what they ended up was the most recent round of a nationwide uprising against the Islamic Republic. Additionally, it wasn't 300 people that were killed. Those are those confirmed by sources like Amnesty. It was over 1,500, as cited by Reuters, and other Iranian human rights groups say that number is even higher. And the reason at the end of the day that the regime decided temporarily to halt the executions of these three young men is because of the pressure it saw. This campaign started from inside Iran itself, from Fatemeh Sepehri, who is the widow of an Iranian war martyr against the war with Iraq. She started this campaign after she herself was released from prison, and it took on an international level thereafter. Iranians inside the country, Iranians in exile, and even foreigners joined in on this, as your report alluded to. But what's important to understand is why these individuals, why these young men, and I say young because these are boys really, why were they arrested in the first place? That's a critical question. They were arrested for the mere crime, according to the Islamic Republic, of expressing their opinion. And there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, like them. Your figure cited 251 executions in Iran last year, but 1,500 people were executed in the streets when the regime mounted heavy machine guns and took them out with no remorse whatsoever. So those figures are regrettably low, the ones you cited. But at the end of the day, what this shows is that this regime does bow down to pressure from its people and from those abroad.
Satara, Cameron is suggesting that no, indeed, domestic and perhaps even more importantly, international pressure led to Tehran bowing down and halting these executions. Do you agree?
Well, it's important to remember that Iran, especially after these economic problems that we have been facing and which have escalated following the pandemic, has been more cautious with hearing the voice of its people, especially after the low turnout that we had in the elections in February. But it's also very important to remember that the request of retrial was already submitted by the lawyer of these three young men, one of them actually, and it was in the process even before the hashtag started. And we have to also remember that the Twitter space is not reflective of the Iranian society, of the majority of Iranian society. I don't know who was behind the hashtag that it got so much publicity and so much support. And I'm very happy that the retrial is going on. And I hope that these three young men will never be executed. But also let's remember that according to the lawyer of Amir Hossein, these three young men were also involved in burglary and they threatened a woman and they attacked a woman with their cold arms. But execution definitely is not what they deserve. So I'm not sure if this campaign played a role in halting the execution, but I can say that I feel the government establishment is listening to its people more than before because it doesn't want to lose its legitimacy among its people, and because
Borzu, how do you explain? Let's bring in Borzu Daragahi at this particular point. How do you explain this seemingly change of heart on the part of the Iranian government, which is rather unusual?
First of all, it was the case itself was unusual. Iran doesn't execute protesters, and although there are a large number of the death penalty is a problem in Iran, and it is perhaps used far too often. It shouldn't, in my opinion, it shouldn't be used at all, whether in Iran or in the United States, which has also been experiencing an increase in federal executions. But it was weird that they would pursue this. Many of these cases, many of these death penalty cases are in Iran and other Middle East cases, in other Middle East systems that are influenced by the Quran and Islamic law and so on. There's an automatic retrial when someone is sentenced to death, when someone is given the ultimate sentence. So I'm not sure if the hashtag had anything to do with the Iranian government's decision. I'm sure they were noticing it, and I'm sure that it might have played a role in their timing and in how they calculated and so on. But I also think more likely than not, given the context, the Iranian government was delighted to see people tweeting about this death penalty case that they could easily deal with and subdue versus its disastrous handling of the COVID-19 pandemic or the economy or just the general political climate.
So if I understand you correctly, Borzu, you're saying the sentencing was actually distraction from the economic crisis and the poor handling of COVID-19.
I'm not sure if it's a calculated decision. I'm not sure if there was any strategy behind it. But empirically speaking, if you look at what happened in the Iranian discussions, and by the way, Twitter is just a disaster. I think maybe up to 90% of the Iranian-related content on Twitter is state-backed or state-financed garbage. Telegram is where Iranians go to get information and trade ideas and so on.
Cameron, as you said before, you firmly believe that the social media campaign and the hashtag Do Not Execute did play a role and was the driving force here. How do you explain the success of this social media campaign? How do you think this campaign gained speed in the first place? After all, we know that most of these social media sites are banned in Iran, where this tweet and this hashtag supposedly originated from.
Well, first of all, it's important to get rid of this notion that this is the Islamic Republic's process or the judicial system working on its own, as if these appeals are something that are a right of all Iranians. They're not, in no uncertain terms. Let's discuss briefly the process of these three young men. They were arrested for partaking in protests. First of all, something that should not happen in any democratic country, any civilized country. We don't expect that in places like Turkey or Germany or the United States, and certainly that they would be given the death penalty for such an offense. Second, when they were in the court, when they were in the court process, they were tortured beyond belief. They were hung upside down. They were beaten. We've been told that they were electrocuted or hit with electrical wires. In fact, the torture was so bad, Ali, that when one of the gentlemen, one of the young men, was entering the courthouse, he had to enter the courthouse using a wheelchair. So this process that the other two guests are referring to, as if we are now in the ultimate phase of this regular legal process, is simply farcical. The Islamic Republic does not follow normal legal procedures. They do whatever the supreme leader says and whatever his appointees say. And to the other point that the regime did this to avoid losing legitimacy, the regime lost its legitimacy a long time ago. A 2018 poll from Tilburg University from Amor Maliki says that if a referendum were held on the Islamic Republic, 70% of Iranians would vote against it. In 2019, 1 year later, that number rose to 79%. After the massacre we saw in November, the downing of the Ukrainian airline, we can only imagine that number is much higher. So the only logical thing to say is that it was this campaign of Iranians inside the country, Iranians in exile, and support from foreigners, providing them air cover, if you will, that forced the regime to end this. And as to how it grew so quickly, Iranians are looking for outlets to protest against this regime. They did so in November. They were met with brutal force, and now they're looking for other means to do so. So we can continue to see Iranians protest against this Islamic regime in social media, on the streets, and in many other forms.
Both Cameron and Borzu Setareh are saying that these three should never have been sentenced in the first place, let alone be given the death penalty. Iran, of course, carries out more executions than any other country on this planet, second only to China. Do you think that this case might open to a greater debate about the use and implementation of the death penalty in Iran?
Well, I don't know where your guest in Washington gets his information from, but I live in Iran and I saw the protests down the street just a few meters from my home. And I know that peaceful protesters do not deserve any kinds of persecution, but it's important to know, and I'm going to repeat that according to their lawyer, they were involved in more than just protesting. They have accounts of robbery and using cold arms. And again, I'm not saying that this.
But even the United Nations, if I may interrupt, the United Nations is saying that those admissions on the part of the three men were extracted through terror and through at the end of the day. What do you say to that?
We know which governments and which people are influencing the UN with their money and with their think tanks. I'm not going to get into that. But
So you're saying torture could not have played a role here whatsoever? Is that you're saying?
I don't know. No, that's not what I'm saying. I don't know if they have been tortured in the prison. I have no information on that. But what I'm saying is that according to their lawyer, it wasn't that they were arrested only for protesting. Also, let's remember that you showed this Masih Alinejad, who has no legitimacy, no place to talk about Iranians. She is the one who calls for sanctions on Iranians, and sanctions are crippling the economy in Iran, are killing Iranians. So these kind of people who were actually behind the hashtag too do not care about Iranian lives. If they care, they would not call for sanctions on Iranian ordinary people, on innocent citizens. So it's very important to see who is supporting that hashtag, who is saying that it was the hashtag that changed the legal system or the legal process.
There are quite a number of people who are now jubilant in the aftermath of the suspension. Now the Supreme Court has agreed to a retrial, but it seems to be a bit too early to celebrate and to speak of a turning point, doesn't it? At the end of the day, this week alone has seen several other executions, including a man convicted of spying for the CIA. So this is perhaps just a drop in the bucket, isn't it?
I mean, I think the core problem is, and I would be interested in hearing what Setare has to say about this, is the Iranian judiciary system. It is not independent. It is completely intransparent, especially when you talk about there's like a double-tiered court system where you have the normal courts and then you have what's called the revolutionary courts. And these revolutionary courts, you speak to the lawyers that deal with these courts. They're banned sometimes. The lawyers are banned from defending their own clients. There's no documents released. They're not permitted to see evidence against their clients. And so the way the legal system is just completely against the defendants, especially when cases are about national security. You throw in a spying charge. There's no way actually to look at the evidence yourself. If you're a journalist or if you're a public advocate, there's zero transparency in those particular cases that deal with security and so on.
Setare,
that is a problem.
Let's give Setare the chance to respond, because you have addressed that question at her directly, saying that there's no independent judiciary in Iran to speak of. Setare, what's your response?
Well, I agree that there is no transparency, and that's a big criticism that I think all walks of life of people in Iran have. And I'm not supporting everything that happens in the legal system. I'm not saying that the process is even fair. But what I'm saying, I'm just repeating the words of the lawyer of these protesters. And he also has criticized the legal system and the head of the judiciary, and I agree with him. But what is important is that the accounts of what is happening in Iran that we hear from people like, for example, Alinejad, or people like him, like her, and especially people like MEK, is also not true. And I personally, as someone who lives in Iran and is witnessing these things, do not like to see their fake support for Iranian citizens. And I know that they're supporting things like sanctions and funding terrorism against Iranian innocent people. So I think there are two different discussions. One is that the legal system in Iran needs reformation, which I absolutely agree with. And the other one is who is supporting those, let's say, hashtags, campaigns, and who supports these young people who were not only protesting. I'm not saying that they have to be, even for
Cameron, the sanctions have come up quite a bit, and Setare is saying they are hurting the Iranian people and are justified. You are based in Washington, D.C., of course, in the country that is applying those sanctions and enforcing those in the first place. Are you in favor of sanctions against Iran?
Ali, there are a few things in this world that are black and white. I think one of those things should be that young men, young children, should not be executed for partaking in protests. So the fact that your guest from Iran is insisting on taking this conversation in the direction of sanctions, I think purely shows that she has no defense for this indefensible action on behalf of the regime that she supports. Let's take a look at the history.
Nonetheless, why don't you humor
of
me
this
and answer my
regime's
question?
Justice system as it's. Sure, I will. Sanctions, when targeted at human rights oppressors like the Islamic Republic, are absolutely justified. What is happening in Iran, Ali, is crimes against humanity on a mass scale. In November, as I earlier mentioned, the protests that your guest in Iran says she did not see, perhaps because she did not want to see them. When the regime mounted heavy machine guns in the marshes of Mashhad and mowed people down, that is a crime against humanity. So for her to sit in Iran and say that she is defending the Iranian people against sanctions, there is a much bigger enemy than the impact of sanctions, and that is the Islamic Republic itself, which for 41 years has indiscriminately killed people based on their political beliefs, their sexual orientation, and myriad other things for no reason at all. So we're talking about these three young men today, Amir Hossein Mohammad and Saeed. What is so regrettable is that there are other people every day being killed by this regime. Just 2 weeks ago, a man was executed for drinking alcohol. He has two young boys who no longer have a father at home with them because the regime killed him. There are innumerable examples
Let's give Setareh just briefly.
Like
let's give Setareh just briefly a chance to respond here, because at the end of the day, Cameron is saying, perhaps you did not want to see the protests that were taking place.
I don't know where, like I said, I don't know where he got that from, because I said, unlike him, that who is talking about the protests, I saw them and they were just a few meters away from my home, and I saw people protesting peacefully. So I don't know where he got that from. And I'm not surprised that he supports sanctions.
Ali, where I got that from is videos which show these massacres.
No, I mean, where did you get that I said that I didn't see the protest? So, okay.
Well, Borja, let me ask you this, because
I mean,
clearly
I don't have any words for someone who supports sanctions and who kills Iranian innocent citizens. I don't have any words for someone who supports sanctions, but at the same time claims that they do not, they are against execution. Sanctions.
Well, I think that disagreement between the two of you has come out quite clearly. Borja, let's talk about this case again, once again, about the three young men whose executions were suspended. Do you think that this case that has made international news and that we are talking about here on today's show will have greater ramifications, wider ramifications from here on?
I think that, and I cover Iran regularly, and I told my editors that this is a tempest in a teapot, that they'll never execute these guys, but they like the idea of this advertisement of what can happen to you if you protest going out, and they basically had the Iranian opposition basically signal casting that if you protest, if you're a young guy and you protest, you might actually get the death penalty. And this went on and on and on for days all over the world. And I know Iranians. Up until just a couple of years ago, I used to travel regularly to Iran for work. Those middle-class people who are potentially thinking of protesting, they're going to think twice now that this threat of possibly being executed for protesting is so prominent now. But I had a feeling from the very beginning of this that knowing how Iranians are, which Iranians are executed, why they're executed, in what way they're executed, I had a feeling this would never, ever, this execution would never come to fruition. And I told my editors that.
Setareh, you've said previously on the show that you do believe and agree with Borzu that there's no such thing as an independent Iranian judiciary. Would you then be a favor of taking this particular case that we're talking about on today's show and abolishing, taking that as a reason to abolish the capital punishment in your country?
Well, I think that depends on what the people in Iran want. And
No,
as
I'm
long
asking
as the
you.
majority are-
Unfortunately, we don't have the time to poll millions of people at this particular point. I'm asking you, would you be in favor of the abolition of death penalty in Iran?
abolition of the death penalty for expressing opinions against that of the government, absolutely. And charges which are related to like spoinage or I don't know, things that can be justified in many ways, that can be made off against the victims and the convicts. I'm absolutely against that.
Okay,
But,
well, clearly, I'm sorry,
I-
we have to wrap it up. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Clearly, much more to discuss, but unfortunately, we don't have time for that. I can thank my guests for joining us, and thank you out there for watching as well. See you next time for a new edition of Newsmakers.